Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. Well, hello, people. Welcome to Give the People What They Want. Great to be with you. It's today, the 21st of January. You notice I keep checking my calendar because I'm not sure what day we are in, least of all, what year. I gather it's 2022. You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashant, your fabulous co-editors of a super site. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Really happy to be with you again. As I said, I keep checking the date, particularly the year. I can't imagine how many Oxfam reports I've read over and over and over again. Oxfam says, look at the inequality, look at the inequality, look at the inequality. Prashant, how many Oxfam reports are we going to have to read before we are cremated?
That's a very good question. I suspect it's going to be every year. And, sometimes I wonder as journalists, we sort of start getting a bit numb to some of the numbers because every year is just a blizzard of numbers. Speaking of blizzards, actually, interestingly, the World Bank chief has made a comment where he sort of cast a critical eye on Microsoft acquiring gaming company Activision Blizzard for $90 billion. And when a World Bank chief says that, money should be not going into these kind of acquisitions, you kind of know that something is really wrong. But yeah, I think two aspects, of course. One, the numbers are staggering. I mean, the numbers have been, I think, talked about a lot still, very important to talk about. Also because I think the report does a good job of not only looking at the larger numbers, for instance, the fact that the world's 10 richest men have doubled their fortunes, that's been talked about. The 2,755 billionaires who exist in the world today, their wealth, for instance, has grown more during the time of the pandemic than in the previous 14 years, which the report says was already anyway a boom time for billionaires. And then they also, I think, do a good job of, for instance, talking about the, how in terms of gender, how in terms of ethnicity. For instance, the fact that I think, say, about 3.4 million more Black people would be alive today if they had the same expectancy as white people, or the fact that the proportion by which, say, Bangladeshi origin people died in the UK due to the pandemic, as opposed to white people. And inequality is this thread that basically connects so many of these issues. And, I think that which is why it's something we keep coming back to this show as well, which is why, for instance, we talk about, say, the tax havens where $32 trillion is supposed to be stashed, where we talk about, for instance, arms spending $2 trillion in 2020 alone. So all these, I think, are recurring themes due to the fact that inequality, for instance, how it feeds into hunger, or inequality, how it feeds into systemic racism, how it feeds into unemployment. And it's important, I think, also at this point to note some of the key points the report makes in terms of recommendations. For instance, one of the key aspects being that they talk about taxation. I mean, taxation, in fact, there's this great number which says that if the pandemic wealth alone, well, there was a 99% windfall tax on that, not only would there'd be enough for all the vaccines in the world, gaps in climate measures, universal health, social protection, etc., in 80 countries. And then, this is the important thing, and then yet these men would still be $8 billion better off in terms of what they were before the pandemic. So staggering numbers, but I think as important is the question of what has to be done. And of course, the Oxfam talks about taxation, but I think we also need to see taxation as in two aspects. One, it also has a rhetorical purpose, but I think there's much more to it, because taxation and extracting that wealth from the billionaires is one part of it, but also how do you invest further is equally the real question. The report, for instance, says that we need to bring it back into what is called the real economy. And for instance, if you look at, say, for instance, the plan to save the planet, which Tricontinental and other research institutes together have realized, there is a concrete set of proposals informed by people's movements across the world in terms of how you would need to invest in health, how you need to invest in education, how you need to invest, for instance, in basic infrastructure. We have the United States, for instance, where your infrastructure bill was finally passed, but after so much of spending being cut down. Across the West, we see governments hesitating to, one, impose taxes on corporates and rich people, of course, but also equally hesitating to spend on health even in the midst of a pandemic. And I think, again, from India, there's a great number which says, for instance, that even I think a 1% tax or something is good enough to massively contribute to the health budget, to the education budget, the kind of importance impact it will make. So I think definitely a twofold battle as far as popular movements are concerned, definitely a twofold battle as far as journalists are concerned as well, to not only track these numbers in terms of inequality, which is an important thing and which we do need to write about, but I think also to track how the government is spending itself. And you cannot disconnect the spending, the way the government works, its refusal to spend across the world, the way political parties, for instance, are moving towards the right in terms of the economy, which has been a long trend. We cannot separate that from the question of inequality. So I think that's really the challenge.
No, that's very true. Speaking of inequality, some of the most unequal places in the world are also places of great violence. I was interested, Colombia is going to have an election in March, presidential election. Ingrid Betancourt has put a hat in the ring. She, some people may remember, is a center-right politician who had been held by the FARC, the Marxist rebels, for some years. She has now come in. There are about 400 candidates who are going to run across the country. I was interested, Zoe, that just yesterday, the head of the UN verification mission of the peace accord says that much more needs to be done in Colombia to ensure the verification of the peace accords, to ensure that peace is being advanced, and yet the violence seems to continue. Take us to Colombia, where it looks like we're not in 2022, but perhaps in the 1970s.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like. On Wednesday, very late at night, there was a car bombing of a office of a building that housed, diverse social movements. It has the alternative media publication Trochando Sin Fronteras. It also houses where they also print their newspapers every day. It has the Peasants Organization, Women's Movement there, Human Rights Foundation, all in this building, the Jorge Eliezer Martinez building, who actually was killed in Arauca in the early 2000s by members of the National Army of Colombia. And so there was a car bombing outside of this building, causing serious structural damage, not only to that building, but also the transportation headquarters, the local educational institute, SENA. One person was killed, 5 are gravely injured. This is truly, as you said, a return to these dark days of Colombia, where violence like this against the civilian population is commonplace. The movements in Arauca, in the center-east region of Colombia, have been very quick to respond and condemn this violence. They have been alerting to the increase in tensions in the region for several weeks now, for several months really. But in the last couple of weeks, a group which calls itself a dissident group of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which demobilized in 2016, had been circulating audios on WhatsApp saying that they were going to target civilian establishments, and specifically, pointed out the buildings, the offices of this social movement in Arauca. They have been calling for measures which do not, add to the militarization of this already very militarized territory. Yet the bombing occurred on Wednesday night. It's really tragic. They have, this movement has contributed to really rebuilding the social fabric in a region where the government has, altogether abandoned the people. They have organized, all of the peasants in the region into different cooperatives to process plantains, cocoa, all sorts of different agricultural products. And so, seeing this attack from, very illegal and kind of bizarre forces that seem to have some connection to the national government, according to the movements in the region, is quite worrying. This is at the same time that the national government is implementing a plan called Future Zones, with Arauca being the first laboratory of this plan. This is a plan from the Ministry of Defense, from the national government, to allegedly increase civilian security by militarization, by adding more troops on the ground. And as the people of Arauca have said for decades, really, this is not the solution to the problems that they face. This is not the solution to, the systemic poverty that they face, the state abandonment. What they need is more infrastructure in the people. And so it's really unfortunate that this has culminated in this way. There's been a lot of solidarity with the organizations of Saravena. This is a building. I myself have stayed in this building several times. All internationalists who come through Saravena stay in this place. It's a place that's home for many people. And so it's just really unfortunate. The Foundation for the Freedom of Press has also condemned the attack. Several, large human rights organizations. And I think what's important now is what happens. How is, what is going to be the response? Is the conflict going to continue to escalate? Are there going to be more civilian targets? The people of Arauca have demanded peace. They said this is the only way forward. We cannot regress back into this violent time. And, hopefully for the people of Colombia, this will happen.
Well, at People's Dispatch, you have a piece from Colombia Informe, an interview with Sonia Lopez. I highly recommend people go and find it. It's called In Arauca, We Have Suffered Every Form of War. Extremely sympathetic article. This sympathetic article comes around the same time that the US President Joe Biden, from gaff to gaff Biden, this time says that Latin America is not, and please mark his words, he's trying to be very sincere, Latin America is not the backyard of the United States, he says, because apparently backyards, it doesn't have a good feel to it. He said instead, no, Latin America is the front yard of the United States. This was supposed to be the liberal way. I suppose for conservatives, Latin America is the backyard. For liberals, Latin America is the front yard. It's the yard nonetheless. Latin America is merely the dog that's allowed to run around the property of the United States. That's the immediate image that I got in my head when I heard Biden speaking about this. Meanwhile, his foreign minister, Antony Blinken, out there in Geneva talking to Sergei Lavrov about the tensions in Ukraine. In whose front yard or backyard is Ukraine? That's a separate question, not a question apparently that Lavrov raised with Blinken. The talks are going nowhere. We had already talked about the fact that the Russians have asked the United States in writing to answer questions about their own security concerns. They want guarantees in writing from the United States that the advancement of NATO will not happen, that their security will be part of the framework of conversation. They asked for that in writing. Blinken came to Geneva today with nothing in writing. The United States has pushed a narrative saying the Russians want war. Lavrov told the press just about an hour and a half ago that, look, this is ridiculous. And he used the word hysteria being driven about this. We don't want a war, he said, regarding the Russian government. He said that, yes, there are troops there, but Russia does not want a war. In fact, Russia has asked Romania to withdraw NATO forces from Romania. Romania is refusing. This is a very tense and serious issue here. When Blinken left the meeting with Lavrov, they all announced that the talks will continue next week. We don't know how it's going to go, but Blinken did say that next week the United States is going to bring something in writing to the meeting. Now, whether these will be, let's say, security guarantees that the Russians are seeking, which could dial down the tension, or it could be a pledge initially for Russia to withdraw troops, it's not clear. What is clear is that the eastern region in Ukraine, including the Donbass part, is in great stress, because the question is, what's going to happen if NATO troops enter there? What will be the relationship of the Donbass with Russia? Will the Russians force the question? And will you see the secession of parts of eastern Ukraine into Russia? That's a serious issue. It's a plausible issue. In fact, if I was to look at the map of Ukraine with you, we could easily see that for the Crimea, which is already absorbed into Russia, the taking of sovereignty or the readjustment of sovereignty in eastern Ukraine would actually benefit the people of Crimea. But all of these are open questions. Nobody has said or put on the table what the demands are. What's very clear is the Russians have asked for a security guarantee. The United States has said that NATO will play a role and is insisting that Russia first say they are not going to fight a war. Each side, my friends, are trying to trap each other. This is the nature of diplomacy. There's a lot of brinkmanship involved here. The Russians want the US to sign a piece of paper saying that we are not going to attack you. And then they can say, look, you said you won't attack us. and the United States wants Russian troops to leave, which then reduces the pressure on Ukraine. It's a kind of silly conflict, and I want to actually say in a word what's silly about it. It's a silly conflict because neither France nor Germany are actually going to allow Ukraine to join NATO. This is a moot question. NATO doesn't want Ukraine. Ukraine wants to be part of NATO. The United States is using the question of Ukraine and NATO in a sense to needle the Russians. So it's a really bizarre conflict. And so far we haven't had honest words spoken. They are, as I said, jockeying for control, jockeying for the narrative. Let's see where this goes. Today happens to be the death anniversary of Vladimir Lenin. It's an important day. We have seen the Russians, particularly after all these years, coming back to look favorably at their 70-year period in the USSR. We'll come back to that story. That's a story that keeps coming. Every once in a while, we hear a poll coming from Russia, and not just older people who have nostalgia, even younger people saying, hey, listen, look at the world now and look at what it could have been. It's still on the table, friends. How will the Russians look to Lenin, in another 100 years? Interesting thing to look at. Well, the president of Tunisia is nothing like Lenin, not at all. Lots of drama in Tunisia. Zoe, take us to Tunis.
Well, yesterday, a protester actually died who was commemorating the 11 years since the revolution, which, took down the dictatorship. A very important moment, not only in Tunisia, but in North Africa. And, I think I start with the death of this protester because I really think it signifies the direction that Tunisia is headed in. In July, Saied essentially staged what now many progressive forces within Tunisia recognize as a coup, suspended parliament. Since then, there has just been a gradual and systemic deterioration of the institutions within Tunisia, the rule of law, human rights violations. And, the Tunisian democracy is often held up as one of the kind of best cases of the Arab Spring, process. A lot of countries, of course, we only have to look to Egypt to know, how south things went in some cases. But Tunisia, relatively stable, was able to recover a lot of democratic rights that had been previously denied. Opposition parties that had been banned saw a new, hope to be able to operate democratically, have rights. And since, July, there has just been a constant attack on the opposition, on different institutions, not only progressive parties such as the Workers' Party of Tunisia, one of the, largest Marxist parties in the country that has, been quite successful in the past, but also the Ennahda movement, which, gained a lot of power in the last elections. And so on January 14th, the 11th anniversary of this historic revolution that really in its moment was able to put an end to, decades of dictatorial rule, this protest was met with, mass repression, a lot of violence against protesters. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the people who was attacked and suffered grave injuries in this repression did succumb to his injuries. There have been, investigations opened up on opposition leaders. One of our comrades, Hamma Hamami, is one of these opposition leaders who is now, likely facing a legal investigation by authorities in Tunisia. So I think all signs are pointing to, serious setbacks in democracy in the country that, started with the coup and has just been intensifying in recent days. It's really important to stand with the people of Tunisia because this democracy, which is so young, just 11 years old, is just gravely under threat. The parties are losing, their rights to be able to organize, to be able to hold events. Of course, COVID restrictions are often used to kind of justify this clampdown on their rights, but I think we also have to see it for what it is. There's a lot of human rights organizations that have come out and been consistently, condemning the actions from the government. I think we're going to see more of this, and we'll see how the opposition parties continue to fight back against this enclosure of their rights as citizens of Tunisia.
it's not just in Tunisia that this is happening. And of course, Tunisia is a formal democracy, but further to the west in Morocco, the royal family, the sclerotic kingdom of Morocco, led by the Makhzen, a name which means warehouse. That's where the king used to pay the salaries of his retainers. That's why the ruling elite is called the Makhzen. Um, Deeply emboldened by the so-called Abraham Accords, pushed by the Trump administration in August 2020, illegal accords, because the United States forced, essentially, or not forced, dragged happily. The royal families of the UAE and Morocco were dragged happily to normalize relations with Israel. The price that the Palestinians paid for this was also paid by the people of Western Sahara. The Sahrawis suddenly found, by George Bush's diktat to Mohammed the king, that, oh, the United States now accepts Morocco's annexation of Western Sahara since 1975, an illegal annexation, by the way. Now, underneath that, and I've done a story for Globetrotter, which appears on the People's Dispatch website. I did a story about this because underneath all this is phosphates, one of the most important components of fertilizer. And it turns out, I didn't get into this too much, but these are conflict phosphates, because a large part of the Moroccan phosphate exports is from Western Sahara, is phosphates they are mining in this illegal territory, and they send it to two countries, essentially, New Zealand and India. In India, the phosphates go to Orissa, where they are then processed by the Podar group. This group is basically laundering conflict phosphates for the Moroccan annexation of Western Sahara. And this is all happening at the same time as the government in Western Sahara, government in Morocco, the monarchy, is cracking down on dissent, throwing people in prison. There's a story, Zoe, you have about the crackdown against Democratic Way, the left party inside Morocco, and so on. So anybody inside Morocco who criticizes the occupation of Western Sahara is seen as, what in India is called anti-national, but in this case basically is anti-monarchy. And that is, with the kind of lèse-majesty laws you have, it's a very serious issue. You can go to jail for a long time. But now the United States has validated the annexation of Western Sahara. This comes as a great problem for the United Nations, for the rule of law, for the Europeans, which is why Secretary General has sent a new personal envoy to Syria, Stefan de Mistura. Now, Mr. de Mistura, Stefan de Mistura. Mr. de Mistura, I feel sorry for him because he has been sent by the UN to solve the conflicts in Iraq, to solve the conflict in Afghanistan. Please digest what I'm saying. He has been sent as a personal envoy to solve the Afghan conflict, the Iraq conflict, the Syria conflict, at the worst point of the attempt to overthrow the government in Syria. Now he has been sent to tackle the question of Western Sahara. I doubt very much that Mr. de Mistura will be able to accomplish anything. He did go to Rabat, did meet the foreign minister of the king. He did go to meet Polisario, the organization of the people of Western Sahara, in the camps in Algeria and so on. So he has gone and met everybody, but I very much doubt that the meetings that had been held by his predecessor in Geneva, again in Geneva, the United States and the Russians meeting in Geneva. Now, will we see the return of Polisario, the Moroccans and others to Geneva to talks? I doubt it, because the Moroccans say, look, Western Sahara is ours. The world monopoly on phosphates is ours. Billions of dollars a year made in phosphates. Just to cycle back to your earlier story, Prashant, the king of Morocco is worth about $8 billion. That's a lot of money. The people of Morocco, meanwhile, struggling to survive every day. Morocco's biggest exports, phosphates and marijuana, exported to hashish, really, exported to Europe. These are big concessions, and the king makes money on both of them. That's the status of Morocco, major ally of the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other so-called democratic powers. Did I say democratic powers? What else am I supposed to say? The summit of democracies. Imagine the king of Morocco speaking there, the king of Saudi Arabia speaking there, Joe Biden speaking there, talking about Latin America being his front yard. Summit of Democracies, wasn't that just on recently? Well, I suppose. Meanwhile, Summit of Democracies in Britain, Boris Johnson said, I didn't go to the party last week. He talked about that. Remember, I didn't go to any party. It was a party. Well, I didn't know it was a party. We said last week, you don't know what they think about what a party is. Prashant, United Kingdom, I can't follow anything. I sometimes look at BBC, not sure if I'm watching a cartoon show or watching the news. Tell us what's up there.
Right. I mean, it's obviously a mess at home, and as if that's not enough, in the long tradition of Britain, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and the Defense Secretary are in Australia, where Liz Truss very proudly proclaimed that took a stance according to media reports against the dictatorships, that is Russia and China, and says the democracies of the world would work together against them. Now, this is highly ironic considering the fact that the UK is seeing a series of bills that are being moved through Parliament right now, all of which are extremely dangerous in various ways. And all of them again connected to COVID-19, again connected to the question of democracy itself. For instance, we have the police and courts bill, which is being considered one of the biggest attacks on protests so far, and it is such an offensive bill that the House of Lords voted down certain sections of the bill which the government had proposed. Now, you need to think about this, that the House of Lords, which is basically the epitome of, it's a House of Lords. But nonetheless, they voted down certain provisions saying that these were too much of an offense on public liberty. For instance, the fact that the police had the power to impose noise restrictions on protests, or the fact that, and this whole law has been filled with a variety of provisions which are very controversial. There was, for instance, a provision which made destroying a statue could be punishable by crime. If protests could be termed especially annoying, those who participated could be, endangered. If people locked themselves to certain public facilities, those protesters could be punished. So an all-out attempt by the Conservative government to really outlaw protests. And we need to also see that this is definitely targeted against radical protest action. I mean, they're fine with protest action, which is, symbolic. But anytime protest action begins to get, according to in their terms, disruptive, that for them is a problem. And we only recently talked about, for instance, how a group like Palestine Action was able to shut down Elbit because of protest actions, which were not just about raising slogans. They were also about actually taking direct action. So that's, of course, one aspect. That's one controversial legislation. Then there's a nationalities bill, for instance, which again has been widely criticized. Legal organizations have called it racist. They've called it a blow to human rights, not only in the United Kingdom, but for Europe as a whole, because among other things, it allows the Home Secretary to remove citizenship from a British citizen without notice, without notification. And that's a huge expansion of powers. It also again, it also causes grave problems for people who want to, for instance, take asylum, the kind of restrictions that they're going to face. And again, many of these people forced to seek asylum because of the wars which the United Kingdom has prosecuted along with its allies in various parts of the world, people from Syria, people from Iraq, for instance. All of these migrants, all of these refugees going to face much more tougher times trying to not only, come to Britain and apply for citizenship, but even live there. And then there is a health and care bill. We saw at the beginning of the month a massive number of absentees in the National Health Service because the sheer amount of work and the illness that they had to endure during the third wave of the pandemic. And now what the Conservative government is proposing is what is basically involved in what is going to be a large-scale privatization of the National Healthcare Service. They're going to integrate far more private players into the process, break it down into a number of circles, which will have to collaborate closely with private players. So whether it be, the status of refugees and migrants, whether it be policing and law and order, whether it be the issue of health with the National Health Service, one of the few legacies of an earlier time, or in all these aspects, we see a complete attack. So democracy, big question there for the United Kingdom.
Big question left, democracy in the United Kingdom. Also must say that a great friend of this show, Give the People What They Want, Ola Bini, is going on trial in Ecuador, where he has been harassed for the last several years. Friend of Julian Assange, they call him. Well, he's my friend too. And I know he's a friend of many people. I'm talking about Julian Assange. That's not a crime, not yet. If you visit him in Belmarsh prison, are they going to imprison you as well? That's what they're doing to Ola Bini in Ecuador. You've been listening to Give the People What They Want. coming to you from People's Dispatch, where you'll find all these stories and more, brought to you by your editors, Prashant and Zoe. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Very happy to have you join us every Friday. We come here on Friday because we're brought together by our producer, Surangia. It's really great to have a producer who keeps reminding us to do things such as record our audio. So give some love to Surangia. Don't forget, we like those selfies. More selfies from you. Give the people what they want, selfies. That's what we want from you. See you next week. Bye.